Imagine being lowered into a pitch black hole in the middle of a dense, sweltering jungle, armed with nothing but a standard issue flashlight, bayonet and a pistol, crawling on your hands and knees, through a dirt tunnel so tight that your shoulders scrape the walls on both sides. The air is thick, metallic and severely lacking in oxygen. You are 50 feet underground, knowing that around any blind corner you might find a tripwire, a venomous snake, or an enemy soldier waiting in the dark, with his weapon pointed directly at your face. It wasn't a horror movie. For a highly specialized, completely volunteer group of American and Australian soldiers during the Vietnam War, this was a daily reality. They were known as the Tunnel Rats. They had arguably the most terrifying, psychologically demanding job in all of military history. To understand who these men were, what they endured, and why they were so desperately needed, we have to look beneath the surface of the Vietnam War. Literally. We have to look at one of the most astonishing feats of military engineering that was ever constructed: the Cu Chi Tunnel Network. When we think of the Vietnam War, the images that come to mind are usually massive helicopters thumping over tree-lined napalm strikes or grueling firefights in the tall elephant grass. It was a war of attrition, fought on the surface, but there was an entirely different war happening simultaneously, completely hidden from the land and the sun. The Viet Cong didn't just dig a few trenches to hide artillery fire, they built an entire suburban world. We're talking about a massive labyrinth-like network stretching for over 120 miles, and it spanned from the outskirts of South Vietnam capital Saigon all the way to the Cambodian border. Now, to call it a tunnel network almost does it a disservice, because it really was an underground fortress. The origins of these tunnels actually date back long before any American involvement in the Vietnam War. The digging began in the late 1940s during the First Indochina War, when the Vietnamese were fighting the French colonial forces. Now, back then, they were simple. Rudimentary hiding spots, small bunkers dug by local villagers using hand tools meant to stash weapons or hide from passing patrols. But when the American military arrived in the 1960s with their overwhelming firepower, massive B-52 bombers and advanced artillery, the Viet Cong realized that staying on the surface meant certain death. They couldn't win a conventional stand-up fight against the Americans, the most technologically advanced military on Earth, so they went underground, expanding those old hiding spots into massive, sprawling, multi-layered complexes. The construction of the Cu Chi tunnels is staggering when you consider how it was done. There were no heavy excavators, no modern drills, no surveying equipment. The tunnels were dug entirely by hand, mostly at night to avoid detection by American reconnaissance planes. Men, women and children from local villages used simple iron hose and woven bamboo baskets to carve through the laterite clay. The specific type of clay was crucial, because during the wet monsoon season it was relatively soft and easy to dig, but when it dried during the summer, it baked into a material that was almost as hard as concrete, allowing the tunnels to withstand the shocking waves of heavy bombing above. They dug out the dirt, hoisted it to the surface, and then had to carefully scatter it in the jungle, dump it into rivers, or disguise it as architectural land, so that the American planes wouldn't spot fresh mounds of earth. It was a monumental, painstaking effort. The resulting network was a marvel of defense architecture, and it wasn't just a single tube. The Cu Chi tunnels were built in multiple levels, sometimes going 3 or 4 stories deep. The first level might be 10 to 15 feet underground, enough to survive light mortar fire. The second level was deeper, maybe 30 feet down, and the third level could be up to 50 feet deep, completely impervious to all but almost massive direct hits from heavy American artillery fire. Now, connecting these levels were impossibly narrow trapdoors, specifically sized to fit the general smaller frames of the Vietnamese Cong fighters, whilst keeping larger American soldiers completely stuck. The tunnels were deliberately designed with sharp 90-degree zigzag turns at every few yards. This wasn't some kind of mistake though. The zigzags were a very specific purpose-built object. If an American soldier threw a grenade down the tunnel, the explosion and shrapnel would be absorbed completely by the dirt wall at the next corner. rather than travelling down the entire length of the shaft of the tunnel. They also incorporated U-bends that dipped down and then backed up, designed to hold water. Now, these acted as natural liquid seals to prevent poison gas or tear gas from spreading through the entire complex. There were heavy wooden blast doors designed to stop the pressure waves from surface bombings. But perhaps the most ingenious part of the architecture was the ventilation system. You can't have thousands of people living underground without air. The Viet Cong created thousands of tiny, completely unnoticeable air holes that reached the surface. Some were disguised as termite mounds, carefully crafted to look completely natural, whilst others were hidden inside a hollowed gut root or large jungle trees, or concealed under thick patches of brush. And people really did live down there. This wasn't just a place to hide for a few hours. Entire battalions of Viet Cong fighters lived in the Coochie tunnels for weeks or even months at a time. They had functional hospitals where surgeons operated on wounded soldiers by the light of a single flashlight, sometimes using bicycle wheels hooked up to a dynamo to generate a tiny bit of electricity. They had living quarters, weapon workshops where they would dismantle unexploded American bombs to harvest the explosives, and underground kitchens. Now, cooking underground does present quite a bit of problem, because the smoke from the fire would travel through the ventilation shafts and immediately give positions away to the Americans. But to solve this particular problem, the Viet Cong invented something called Hoang Kham stove. And it was a brilliantly designed stove that captured the smoke, completely diverted it through a series of long underground trenches that cooled the smoke down and then released it slowly in a fine, completely invisible mist hundreds of yards away from the actual kitchen. They also specifically chose to cook early in the morning so that any faint traces of smoke would simply blend in with the natural morning fog of the dense jungle. Now, despite these incredible feats of engineering, life in the tunnels was absolute hell. The air was foul, smelling of sweat, human waste and damp earth. It was suffocatingly hot. Oxygen levels were dangerously low, leading to a constant headache and fatigue. Disease rampant. Malaria, dysentery, severe intestinal parasites plagued all of the soldiers. They shared dark, cramped quarters with rats, venomous centipedes, scorpions and spiders. Food was scarce, often reduced to nothing but a couple of edible roots and a handful of rice. Yet, despite the unimaginable suffering of these soldiers, the tunnels provided exactly what the Viet Cong needed, and that was absolute invisibility. Now, for a long time, the American military command had absolutely no idea that the extent of what lay beneath their feet was so expansive. They would conduct massive search and destroy operations through the jungle. They would encounter a squad of Viet Cong every so often and engage them in a fierce firefight. But then suddenly, the enemy would simply vanish. They would disappear into thin air. American troops would secure areas in the bush and find nothing. It was Mandarin. It felt like fighting ghosts. And it wasn't until January of 1966, during Operation Crimp, that the true scale of the underground network was discovered. Over 8,000 American and Australian troops swept through the Hobu Woods, an area notoriously controlled by the Viet Cong. Now, during the sweep, the American sergeants literally sat down on what they thought was a patch of dirt, only to find a nail prick in one of their pants. And when this sergeant looked closer, he realised it was a cleverly disguised wooden trapdoor. So now the military had final proof of the underground network, and their initial solution was a straightforward one: destroy it from the surface. When a tunnel entrance was found, standard operating procedure was to completely toss down a few fragmentation grenades, maybe pump it with some tear gas or phosphorus, and then call in heavy-duty combat expertise with the entrance of a C4 explosive and blow it up. But unfortunately for them, that didn't really work. Because of the zigzag turns, the blast doors and the water seals, the explosion and gas only damaged the very top layer base of the tunnel entrances. A few yards down, the main network remained completely untouched. The Viet Cong would simply wait for the Americans to leave, dig out the collapsed entrance from below, and go right back to using the tunnel. They even tried pumping thousands of gallons of water into the tunnels to flood them out, but the network was so vast and had so many hidden drainage routes leading to the Saigon River that the water just vanished into the earth. Now, commanders quickly realised that dropping explosives into a hole wasn't going to win the subterranean war. Furthermore, they realised that by simply blowing up the entrances, they were destroying incredibly valuable intelligence. Down in those tunnels were enemy maps, battle plans, troop rosters, and massive weapons caches. They needed that information. They realised that the only way to effectively clear the tunnels was to map them out, gather intelligence, and to send men down in the dark to do it by hand. And that's exactly how the famous tunnel rats were born. Now, there was no formal training in the beginning for these tunnel rats. It wasn't an official military occupation speciality. It started as a completely ad hoc, terrifying experience. The order came down: find volunteers willing to crawl into the enemy's underground fortress and clear it out. Now, you might wonder, who in their right mind would even volunteer for something like that? The men who stepped forward were a very unique breed indeed. They were overwhelmingly volunteers, mostly infantrymen or combat engineers. Now, physically, they had to be small, so the average American soldier wearing a helmet, a flak jacket, and carrying a rifle physically couldn't fit inside those tunnels. That was practically impossible. So the men who did become tunnel rats were under 5 foot 5 inches tall and exceptionally thin. Many of them were from working class backgrounds, Hispanic, white, black soldiers who found themselves bonding over a shared unimaginable terror of the job. But physical size was really only the first requirement. The psychological profile of a tunnel rat was incredibly specific. You had to possess an almost unnatural level of courage, combined with a chillingly cold ability to control your own panic. Claustrophobia is a primal human fear. Being buried alive is a complete nightmare, deeply ingrained in our psychology. The tunnel rats had to willingly lower themselves into a situation that triggered every single biological alarm, screaming at them to run away. When a tunnel rat prepared to enter a hole, standard military gear was completely useless. You couldn't wear a helmet, it was too bulky, and it would scrape the ceiling, sending vibrations down into the tunnel that would alert the enemy. You couldn't wear a heavy flak jacket because you'd get wedged in the narrow dirt walls and trapped, and you certainly couldn't carry an M16 rifle, aside from the fact that it was too long to maneuver around tight corners. Firing a high velocity rifle inside a sealed dirt tube would create a massive muzzle blast so violently loud it would instantly blow out your eardrums completely and disorientate you in the dark. So tunnel rats stripped down, often wearing just their fatigue pants and sometimes no shirt at all. They did arm themselves with a bare minimum standard toolkit and a sidearm, which initially was the standard M19 1145 caliber pistol. But even the 45 was terrifyingly loud underground. The muzzle flash would completely blind the shooter in the pitch black, and the noise deafening. So eventually the tunnel rats requested specialised weapons. Some managed to get their hands on the 38 special revolvers equipped with custom sound suppressors, minimising the flash and the noise so they could actually see and hear after firing a shot. Some carried a bayonet or a combat knife clamped between their teeth. Some carried a piece of communication wire tied to their ankles so they could be pulled out if they were wounded. Though many hated the wire because it snagged on the roots and debris. Some decided to go down with nothing but a flashlight, a gun, and a terrifyingly high amount of adrenaline. Now, the descent was the first hurdle here because the trapdoors were often hidden, requiring a soldier to lower himself feet first. The initial drop was a moment of pure vulnerability. You had no idea it was at the bottom of the shaft. The moment your boots touched the floor, the darkness swallowed you. The heat was instantaneous, and the smell of clay, sweat, and rotting vegetation was overwhelming. And then, silence. Once the trapdoor closed above you, the sounds of the jungle, helicopters, gunfire, and birds completely vanished. You were alone in a silent, suffocating tomb. Moving through the tunnel was antagonizingly slow, incredibly dangerous, because you couldn't just crawl forward. You had to probe every single inch of dirt in front of you. The Viet Cong knew the Americans were sending men down, and they turned the tunnels into a psychological meat grinder filled with horrifying traps. They strung almost every invisible tripwires across the passageways connected to unexploded American artillery shells or fragmentation grenades. Tunnel rats had to feel for these wires in the dark, often using just their fingertips or a tip of a bayonet, gently sweeping the air and the floor. If they felt the wire, they somehow had to disarm that explosive in a space so tight they couldn't even turn their shoulders around. They encountered drop holes, false floors that would suddenly give way, plunging the soldier into a pit lined with punji sticks. Now, these were sharpened bamboo stakes, often coated in human feces or animal venom, designed not to just pierce the skin, but to ensure a horrific, agonizing infection that would take the soldier out of combat. But the most psychological, terrifying traps were the biological ones. The Viet Cong routinely weaponized the jungle itself. They would take extremely venomous snakes, and particularly the bamboo pit viper. American troops called it the two-step snake because the venom was so potent. The joke was, if it bit you, you would take 2 steps forward and drop dead. The Viet Cong would tie these snakes to the ceiling of the tunnels by their tails, right at eye level or neck level. Then the tunnel rat, crawling in the dark, sweeping his flashlight, might suddenly illuminate the fangs of an angry trapped viper inches from his face. They also kept wooden boxes filled with hundreds of highly venomous scorpions or fire ants. They would rig the box with a tripwire, so when the American soldier crawled past, the box would dump a cascade of stinging, biting insects directly onto his back in a space where he couldn't stand up, couldn't run, or even swat them away. Now, every single corner was a potential ambush. The tunnels were designed with murder holes, tiny slits carved into the dirt walls, where a Viet Cong soldier could sit in a concealed adjacent room and thrust a spear through the wall as an American crawled past, or fire a single devastating shot. On occasions when firefights did happen underground, it was unparalleled in its brutality, completely close quarters combat in its most literal terrifying form. It was chaos, a scramble in the blackness defined by a blinding strobe light of muzzle flashes, the choking smell of cordite filling the confined space, and the deafening roar of gunshots that left men's ears bleeding. Often it developed into hand-to-hand combat, 2 men fighting for their lives with knives, bare hands, in the suffocating dirt, completely cut off from the rest of the world. And of course, the psychological toll was immense. The tunnel rats operated in a state of hypervigilance that was difficult for normal human minds to sustain. The fear of a cave-in was constant. The American artillery pounding from the surface above them could cause the walls of the tunnel to vibrate or crack. Heavy B-52 bombing raids, known as arc light strikes, would send massive shockwaves deep into the earth. Now, to be dug in a tunnel during a B-52 strike was described as feeling like being trapped inside a drum while a giant beat on it. The dirt would fall from the ceiling, the air pressure would violently compress, and the sheer terror of being burned alive beneath tons of solid clay was enough to break any man. Some soldiers went down once, scrambling back up to the surface an hour later, completely white and shaking uncontrollably, and simply refused to ever go back down. No one blamed them. It was a widely accepted rule among infantry units that you could not order a man into a tunnel if he didn't want to go. It had to be a choice, because if a man panicked down there, he wouldn't just get himself killed, he would get everyone behind him killed too. And for the men who did it repeatedly, who made it their specialised role, they developed a very interesting sense of fatalism. They learned the architecture of the enemy. They learned how to read the dirt, how to smell the presence of an ambush, and how to navigate the absolute darkness using senses they didn't even know they had. And they were incredibly effective. Over the years, tunnel rats gathered massive amounts of intelligence they hauled out of pages, documents, maps that detailed enemy offences, and also unmasked the locations of hidden command centres. They disrupted the Viet Cong supply lines, destroyed vast underground armories, and neutralised subterranean staging areas that had been used to launch deadly surprise attacks against American bases. They saved an untold number of lives on the surface by braving the horrors down below. But the cost, of course, was staggering, and the casualty rate among the tunnel rats was exceptionally high. Many died from booby traps, ambush fire, or simply the sheer exhaustion and disease that came from operating in that environment. Now, those who did survive rarely came home unchanged. The things that they saw, the claustrophobic terror they endured, left deep psychological scars. They fought a war that the generals on the surface couldn't see, an intimate, brutal, isolated conflict that demanded a level of nerve that defies comprehension. Eventually, the American military strategy shifted. They began deploying massive specialised bulldozers known as roam plows, which literally shaved the jungle canopy away, destroying the hidden ventilation shafts and exposing tunnel entrances. They escalated the carpet bombing, using massive seismic bombs designed to penetrate deep into the earth before detonating, collapsing huge sections of the network, and by the end of the war, vast stretches of the Cu Chi tunnels had been turned into massive craters. Now today, part of the Cu Chi tunnel network has been preserved specifically to accommodate tourists from around the world. I also was one of them. And people walk through them, slightly stoped over, looking at the trapdoors and the ventilation shafts, but walking through a wide and well-lit tunnel on perhaps maybe a Sunday afternoon, as I did. Now, peacetime can never ever begin to replicate the reality of what those tunnels once were. And it's easy to look back at military history and focus on the grand strategies, the generals, the massive operations, and the technology. It's easy to look at the Vietnam War through the lens of political failure and massive surface campaigns. But the true military history is always ultimately about the individual on the ground, or in this case, the individual under it. So the next time you see footage of the Vietnam War, the sprawling jungles and the helicopters, do take a moment to imagine the world 50 feet below that, 50 feet below the camera. Imagine the man who willingly dropped into those suffocating dark tunnels, armed with nothing but a pistol and a flashlight, with an absolutely unbelievable amount of courage to fight the most terrifying invisible war in modern history.